These were such amazingly beautiful papers. I mean, I'm just kind of blown away by it. I'm sure lots of people have questions, so I'll try to keep mine very, very short and try to put them a little bit in conversation with each other. For Vazira, I mean, the obvious question is like, what are they waiting for? What are we waiting for, right? In particular, we think about, you know, as you call the post-colony, right? That there was a presumed sort of universal expectation or goal, right? That was there. And that was political freedom. But you say post-colony, yet we live in this world in which we still have colonization around the world in terms of semi-colonization, right? We live in a capitalist imperialist world. And so the promises, what were, you know, that were imagined were never quite achieved. So that's sort of a question I have about waiting. And for Tina, I guess my larger question is thinking about adjacency as, in what ways is it different from allyship? Because that's the question that most of us do have, those of us who are not Black, right, is to think about what are the limits, what are the ways in which we can think about this, and what can we do, right? And so I think because on one hand, the waiting that you're talking about is a waiting of a positive waiting, waiting for something that's good that's happening, right? And the waiting that I saw in your photos in particular, right, is like, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to the viewer. We're waiting for the blink. And then the blink also became kind of almost a glare, right? And so the waiting is also a little scary for the viewer, right? For the white supremacist or the white liberal or the rest of us, right? And so I was wondering how you would think through these types of waiting and allyship.
Start?
Sure, I can. Quick response. Yeah, thank you. So that's precisely the question. What if we think of it is time to refuse to wait any longer for anti-colonial movements? Nationalism provided that horizon, that moment of arrival. But if one thinks of that moment of political decolonization as a persistence of colonial formations into the present, then this period of waiting, this waiting is itself potentially generative, productive, that we must stay in the waiting, that the waiting might be the place rather than, so we don't have that horizon of anti-colonial struggle, which was nationalism. If you take that away, what then might be the kind of possibility that is opened up by the kinds of formations that the waiting is producing? Yeah.
That's a great question, allyship. So I guess I have to answer it in the context of the work of contemporary artists. And I don't think that their work is producing allyship, because allyship relies upon a particular kind of disparity of privilege, right, that is foregrounded in allyship. Whereas I think that what is happening in adjacency is it is the production of a discomfort that requires labor, that requires work. And so the waiting in Luke's work is really about sustaining discomfort to the point where you have to embrace your implication in it, and that implication can be transformative. And so that's, I mean, sort of in these twin terms that I'm trying to understand about, you know, what is the work of adjacency within a Black gaze, it's really about, you know, what kind of work produces certain kinds of effective labor that, you know, that transform that relationship. So that's a quick answer to it.
Can I just add one more? You sure can. Yeah. It goes to the last question, I think the one that actually Ariella talked about. I mean, okay, I'm a historian, so just to talk about archives. And it seems to me that when you were thinking about archives, you're thinking more about state archives. And I like to quote what Bashar Dumani talks about, how the archives are bleeding because they're so based in violence, and therefore we have to question the categories. But if we think about these archives, They're different archives. How do we think through that kind of archive? Yeah, or everybody, actually, anybody. I just, like, I think we have to have a more expansive view of what we think about the archive, right? We have colleagues who engage, obviously, in oral histories, and they're intentionally trying to, make like an anti-state archive and how to think about that. And they also have their problems as well, too, right? Because archives come with wealth and privilege. So, but I can also just open up to people. Okay, let's open it up. Or you want to?
No, I would like to ask a question. Sure. Thank you both for wonderful presentations. I would like to ask you, Vazira, about time, the waiting, about the theft of time, because time is stolen also, like lands, but it is stolen not only in the way that people are forced to wait because they cannot catch up with modernity, because we cannot let modernity to be the only temporality. So if you can say something about the theft of time, because you spoke more about the waiting, that it is not passive, and you spoke more about the waiting, but there is an active theft, active robbery, like the robbery of land. And Tina, I would like to ask you about this affective labor, and it requires work and it creates discomfort. And you said when you defined adjacency, I already know how to say it. Tina gave me a tip. I told her I cannot say this word, you only forget about the D. Okay, so adjacency. So when you speak about adjacency, so you speak about in spite and across the differences. And I would like to dwell on this a little bit because I think that the adjacency is extremely productive and generative term to think about many questions that we think with other terms, but to think with them through adjacency is really eye-opening. But I would like to ask you to say something. You say in spite and across these differences, and these differences are not the same. There are different contexts. Because the affective labor that you speak about, it's not only about the gallery, right? It precedes by the roles that we inhabit outside of the gallery and also inside of the gallery. So I'm thinking, for example, about, and in this sense, now coming back to your question to Tina, I don't think that whiteness is the same all over. Because I think that, for example, in the context of the US, the affective labor that is required from white descendants of enslavers is different from the affective labor that is required from non-black that are not white descendants from enslavers. And and I think that the adjacency that you showed in relation to Thompson's work, if I understand you well, is about the way that he sees across the differences, from him as indigenous, defining himself as a black, is one thing. I'm thinking about, for example, the context of Israel-Palestine. I think that it is not only the question of across and in spite of the differences. I think that Israeli Jews have a responsibility that is different, that is maybe in adjacency to the responsibility of whites here. So if you can say something about the different types of differences that require different types of adjacencies, because adjacency is not one, and the differences are not one. So
I absolutely agree with you. The in spite and across is about the multiplicity, right, of adjacencies and differences, right? It is supposed to be multiple. And that to me is sort of, that's what I was struggling for, is there are multiple adjacencies even within his work, right? I started out by trying to understand what his relationship was within this critique, right? Because the critique of exploiting Black pain didn't quite ring true to me. And so I started out by trying to understand that. and understanding his positionality. And then I started looking at the ways in which people are inhabiting the space of the gallery and simply inhabiting, having to return the gaze of these individuals. And that labor was different, but it was universal. It was happening. That's with universality. I was having to do it, right? I was having to do it. Different Black folks are having to do it, right? So I'm not trying to say that there is a particular form of adjacency. I'm saying that that labor is quite specific, right? And that labor, that when we partake of that labor, it can be generative. And the reason I'm actually talking about adjacency as labor is because many people would choose not to do that work, right? They would choose to go straight to empathy, right? Which is about sort of, making invisible the fact that, I'm not trying to say we're all the same. I'm trying to say you need to take credit for how you are positioned in relation to, right? And it could be about, white privilege. It could be about different histories of dispossession. It could, and the ones that you're explaining about, that you're referencing in terms of Palestine are one of many. But that, I think, is what I'm offering in terms of the term not being about just one or the other. And I'm trying to talk about specific ones within his work in particular.
Thank you so much for both papers. They were really interesting. My question is for Tina. I have a lot to think about and through. And I'm just curious to hear you talk, if you can. I don't know if it necessarily is relevant to how you're thinking about this, but I couldn't help but think about desire and pleasure in terms of, for instance, you alluded to this when you were talking about the ways in which Philando Castillo's partner Diamond Reynolds was constantly asked to repeat, and the repetition, and the kind of repetition of witnessing to the point that it doesn't necessarily strike me as witnessing, it strikes me as something else. And then the element of desire maybe adding complexity to the comparison between a Dana Schutz and this other New Zealander artist, right? And also your phrase hysterical strength. I just want to give a shout out to it because it's an incredible phrase. And if you could talk about, if you were thinking about this, because I never put those two terms together, but they make so much sense to me. And again, relate to how I see desire playing out here, of the hysterical other, a desire to see pain and persistence and resilience, right, being kind of played out in this excessive way.
So hysterical strength Luke Willis Thompson chose that as the title of this exhibition, citing Nicole Seeley's poem, Hysterical Strength, which is very short, but it's exactly what you're saying. When I hear news of a hitchhiker struck by lightning yet again, when I hear news of a hitchhiker struck by lightning yet living, or a child lifting a 2-ton sedan to free his father pinned underneath, or a camper fighting off a grizzly with her bare hands until someone, a hunter perhaps, can shoot it dead, my thoughts turn to Black people, the hysterical strength we must possess to survive our very existence, which I fear many believe is and treat as itself a freak occurrence. And it's exactly that. It's exactly what you're saying. And I marveled at, his capacity to use that as the title for this assembly of this chorus, right, of hysterical strength that I think he renders. Now, the first part of what you were saying is about desire. And so I violated the terms of political concepts because I slid in a second one because they're two inseparable terms for me. But the notion of adjacency that I'm using within a Black gaze is really about trying to challenge the sort of traditional notions of what the gaze is, which are structured around pleasurable looking. And one of the things that I'm trying to say, and I've actually been teaching that in some of my students were here, and they know that this is my rant, is what if a black gaze was not predicated upon pleasurable looking? What if it were predicated upon, and pleasurable looking is always the desire for someone at someone else's expense quite often, right? And so that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of thinking about the affective later that comes from discomfort that can then be turned around. And then going back to the question of Diamond Reynolds and the demand, you know, just the way in which she has become a surface of projection and anxiety about what is the way she ought to, right? And so I don't know if that's desire or not. I have to think about it. I have to think about it. Yeah.
Thank you both very, very much. I think I'll just pick up right where you left, Tina, if I may, because you just answered part of a question that I had, which was, I was thinking a lot about hooks in the oppositional gaze, which is very much rooted in movies and very much rooted in pleasure. So you've already made that distinction for me, so thank you. What I still have on my mind is the relationship that you might see between the kind of labor of adjacency and Christina Sharp's wake work, because I just saw so many resonances in thinking about how she talks about tending to the dead, and that requires a certain kind of showing up to do that. So I'm just wondering if you see adjacency as being in relationship to that, and where the critical difference is. I mean, I hear so many already, but I just wonder if you could talk more. And if adjacency is something for you that is gallery work. Like, is it specific to the space that one's in to practice it? Or do you see it kind of something that can be applicable to all kinds of other spaces?
Yeah, I mean, there I have to go back to Ariella's point about the multiplicity of it, and that wake work to me is one practice of adjacency, but it is not limited to that. But for Christina, it's about a temporality, right? About the living and the dead, you know, the history that is not past, and our adjacency to that living history of the afterlife of slavery, right? And adjacency, I'm trying to say, positions multiple communities in relationship to their multiple histories of dispossession, and in that way, you know, that's exactly the connection I'm trying to make, and yet trying to exceed the specificity of Blackness in one. As one single iteration. And that's one of the things that I found so extraordinary about Hysterical Strength, of putting into dialogue, you know, Philando Castile and, you know, Cherry Croce and, you know, the Black British context, and then, you know, Donald Rodney. That to me was, and his position in relationship to those multiple histories of dispossession, which are, you know, different and yet need to be inhabited, you know. We need to do similar kinds of work, but very specific kinds of labor in order to position ourselves like that.
Can I follow up on this conversation? So I would like to ask you, Vazira, and then Tina, you, in relation to your conversation, Jasmine and Tina, about Christina Sharp's The Wake Work and the labor of adjacency. Vazira, you spoke about the imperial waiting imposed, which is the exclusion from participation. This was one of your definitions, but then you ended up with the social waiting. And the social waiting, you proposed it as the labor of adjacency, maybe? So if you can think about this social waiting in relation to Tina's work on the labor of adjacency, and Tina, coming back to what you said, when you when you spoke about the communities, the adjacencies of different communities. So if I go back from this to the way that you articulate the term black gaze, so black gaze would be what? It would be the in-between what is given to the gaze and the gaze upon something. If you can say more now about the black gaze in connection to the adjacencies of community.
Thank you. Maybe start with your earlier comment about the theft of time. Then you're asking me about how does one think about imperial conditions of waiting and social waiting as somehow adjacent, political waiting and social waiting being somehow adjacent. And thinking about the theft of time, one could argue then that imperialism and anti-imperialism was always in a tussle over this question of time. And therefore, the period, the post moment of arrival, what you have then is reconfiguration of the conditions in which we need to think about what happens to, what are the coercive conditions in which we might think about history without the horizons of a movement that we had thought about anti-colonial struggles, looking at anti-colonial struggles in. I have to think more about it. I mean, think of theft of time in relation to theft of land and theft of people, while at the same time you have continuous generation of relationships that are reorganizing this post-colony, which is not in political terms that of democracy or electoral politics or the kinds of institutions that one expects or had anticipated, and it is all that in between on the street, this in-betweenness that needs some kind of sort of thinking and reflection and recuperation as not just empty time or wasted time or lost time, but rather one where something is happening such that we are in this moment. So I suppose that's where I began with, which is that we're in this moment where there is a sense of the here and the now that is very visceral. You feel it probably in terms of places where there's movement, right? There's organization, there's uprisings, there's protests, there's all of that which we recognize as, yes, something is happening in these places. So we're in this moment, and as if what preceded it was somehow this empty waiting, and that now that we see this movement, this here and now, that we respond to it. And so to think about this moment as in the movement of this moment, the protests, the mobilizations, the organizations that are happening, somewhat differently from the ways in which we have understood movement. It's not just the continuation of anti-coloniality or anti-imperialism, but something that comes out of waiting, and therefore.
So I think so the big question is like, can you say more about what this black gaze is? And so part of where it's coming from, so this actually connects up to Jasmine's final question about, is this a gallery thing? And so the place that I am using to talk about its emergence is black art, black contemporary art, because I'm trying to understand a shift in what the impact of some black artists' work on the structure, the fundamental structure of spectatorship, right? Such that it's not about the consumption of that art, such that we are actually implicated in it, such that we are positioned in a space of adjacency to, and that's something I talk about, black precarity and black possibility. And so thinking about it that way, right, it may begin in that interaction with a work of art. But I think the implications of it, and that's something that I've also sort of been observing, is about, what is the impact of black contemporary art in this particular moment, right? And that it is doing political work. It is doing transformational work in terms of, confronting people. I mean, the first stuff that I started writing about was, Arthur Jafa's, work, which I have watched audiences, just fall over. And that's something important. But the other part of your question about how does adjacency work within that, right, is that right now I'm interested in the way in which it figures around blackness. I don't think that is exclusive. That's where adjacency for me is important, to sort of not make it exclusive to, and not exclusive to black communities or to a single black community. And to try and think about the ways in which certain work, but beyond that, how can we move beyond allyship? What are the ways in which, how can we mark out, and what I think is important there is, that you have to experience this discomfort and you have to work through it, and it's not going to change our circumstances necessarily. You will still probably be better off than me, or I may still probably be in a better place, right? That's not what it's about. It's about what happens when we cop to it. What happens when you cop to, the fact that this is really fucking uncomfortable, and that I really have to do it and I have to get beyond myself. And that was something that I, when I first started doing this doing this kind of writing, I would show some of these works and people would sort of just stop and ask for a moment. And that would make me enraged, just enraged. Because sort of like, wait, you want to feel better about, what are we looking for here? What is the object of this pause? When it is happening every day and you are watching it, on TV, you're watching on your computer, you're reading about it, and you're suddenly hypersensitive when you're seeing something that you've seen everywhere before. And so I want to actually think about what does it mean to actually inhabit that and get to another place. So, sorry I'm getting impassioned.
I was wondering if you wanted to think about the Palestinian gaze, right? That would be like an adjacency, right? The Palestinian gaze, that would be like an adjacency perhaps, right? But Tom has a question.
I wanted to ask Vazira something. I'm thinking with you about waiting as a place or a time that something else can come out from or grow out from. And I was very intrigued by the Bani Abedi images and the sort of the way some of them, the tone, I guess, the tone and register of some of them, I'm talking about the stills, but to some extent part of the video as well. Something that's between wistfulness and melancholia, but also humor, some sort of humor. And I'm interested in that space and feeling a sort of strange familiarity about that space as a space in which one often is in certain parts of the world or certain certain temporality. So I was just wondering about the mustache, the man whose mustache, who refused to shave his mustache. I'm just wondering how that fits in with the others. And in my Friday evening sort of just tired, associative, cerebral state, I was just thinking, well, that is what happens. That is what grows in the time of waiting, right? The mustache, or the hair, or the nails, and so that is very literally about what grows in the time of waiting. But it also makes me want to think about the folly of waiting, or the strange, the sort of folly or madness one can fall into when waiting, because it becomes very difficult to decide to decide when one has waited for too long, when one should stop waiting. It becomes difficult to determine how long one has been waiting, and on some other level, perhaps beyond one's immediate awareness, it becomes difficult to know whether one is still waiting. So I guess I'm interested in that kind of, whether that sort of trouble or that kind of folly is part of what you're thinking with, and the yawning being the other picture. I was trying to get my head around how would that feed in? Is it that one yawns usually at certain periodic intervals, and so to yawn continuously like that is also some sort of symptom of something gone sort of wacky with time, but in a way that also seems to speak of I don't know, both protuberances and growths, but also kind of folly of time. And I'm asking this partly because at the back of my head is the gravity of stories where people have waited for decades for someone to come back. And there are so many such stories in the subcontinent. So the madness of that kind of wait as well.
Can I add on to that? I was thinking about the different ways in which you can see waiting. You can see waiting as an act of desperation, as you're suggesting, as in Bob Marley's, I don't want to wait in vain for your love. But couldn't you also see waiting as hopeful, that if there is an expectation of something at the end, then it allows you to fill that space, the in-between space, in a productive way? So I'm wondering if waiting might not be more complicated.
Yeah, thank you. That was really, both comments were really helpful. In thinking about waiting, what I didn't want to think with was the end of waiting, the presumption that something happens. There is an anticipation that structures waiting, but rather than thinking about that, what that end might look like, or the focus being what that end might look like. It is that condition of waiting, and for both the routine of waiting, stoppages, barriers, and navigating them in expectation that you will have to go and wait somewhere. That waiting is a sort of the condition of your movement through the day-to-day function of the relationships that are forged around. In which case, for me, the disappearance of people is something that well, I've been thinking about disappearance of people for much longer than Abadi's work. But that always seemed to be what I was. I think of it as what has been helpful for me is to think about the disappearance in relation to the barriers that condition waiting, because in both cases you have a whole set of relationships that form around and in between of this conditional waiting. So that right in that, in those relationships might be something to think about what it is when that moment comes, when you say, I can wait no longer. That, to understand that moment, I can wait no longer, as something that is produced by the kinds of relationships that are forged in that conditional waiting itself. So we have these moments where people say, oh, we can wait no longer, and we will, you know, and you see that as an historian, where you're trained to always look for movement in the archive. It is the action, it is the protest, it is the insurgency, it is movement, rather than the presumption that what is before or after movement is stasis. It is trying to think against that notion of stasis and something else.
Tina, I have a question about sound. So in describing the experience of the gaze in these gallery settings, it seems like part of what cued you to knowing you weren't looking at a still image was the apparatus of the projector, which initially seemed like a hulking thing, or in the early images, but
Bigger than the other ones. It's huge.
yeah. But the sound of the reel too, and then I'm thinking of that in relation to the tessellation of text that you evoked at the end, and a sense of vertigo. So I guess my question is about the sonic work of adjacency, or the other sensorial possibilities of adjacency, which I don't ask to contradict or get away from the gaze, but maybe how are they part of this gaze shift that you're talking about?
Yeah, should we have a question here and then?
Thank you so much. So I just have two sort of small questions for each. Tina, this term of adjacency is so helpful for me in thinking of sort of like this line of thinking that I'm looking at now in terms of like transnational indigenous solidarities and like solidarity building between like different oppressed communities, and how like this sort of different conditions of displacement and dispossession have affected but then also implicated different communities in different ways in each other's oppression. And in terms of like Black and Palestinian solidarity, I was at a presentation and this man, I think, got it totally wrong when he said that solidarity should be about like two communities getting like equal parts, as if it's some sort of like transactional endeavor adjacency. And I think like this term is so helpful in showing this is not the case, because it's about giving back to each other, but not in this sort of parameters of transaction, if I understand right. So maybe you could respond to that, please. And then for Vazira, just to sort of echo what Patsy was saying about waiting, obviously when it's imposed, this is like an imperial violence, and it's used in this way, especially like thinking about Palestine. But I think also waiting is not giving up is a very generative way to think about it. And like we have this term of summud, which is steadfastness. And thinking about like waiting as also like from those who are forced to wait as like in response to this sort of like unbelievable performances of endurance. So like thinking about like endurance and waiting in that sense.
Very tied to the question that was asked about sound. I was really struck, Tina, in your description. First of all, thank you both for such beautiful and moving papers. But to go back to what I was saying, I was very struck in your description, Tina, of how much you were struck by the mechanical sound. Like you talk very much about the clanking. So it's interesting that it's not just sound, that it's mechanical, which I find sort of fascinating, particularly around, for example, the Diamond Reynolds, where there, as you talked about, was so is very much talked about as a kind of electronic circuit, right? Like her using digital media that then gets broadcast on television, and it led to so much commentary about what does this mean about sort of our digital culture and electronic culture that this could be. But yet the artwork you're talking about forces, in a way, a confrontation also with the mechanical, which I'm wondering if you think is tied to the question of labor that you were getting at, a kind of, I don't know. I was struck by that and would just, love to know what you think about it. And I think, again, it ties very much to the question you asked, so, yeah.
I mean, sorry. Yes, the sound is mechanical, and the sound greets you before you get in the room. You hear it coming up the stairs, it's reverberating outside of the gallery. And it is really disruptive when you get into when you're entering, and it's super distracting. And then the interesting thing to me is it disappears. Over the course of you being in that room, you don't hear it anymore because you're so transfixed by this image. But you're absolutely right, it does a certain kind of work of not being projection per se, right? So it is a celluloid encounter that forces you to sort of almost suspend disbelief to the extent that, it really feels like a photograph. It feels like you're watching a photograph. And that disjuncture is also disorienting because you're, particularly in cemeteries, they are so still for so long that these very, very, very gradual and diminished motions are scary. They're kind of haunting because you think that this is a portrait and then they're alive, And so there's something about, on the one hand, he is really trying to think about, the Warhol, screenshots. But at the same time, he's also trying to, there's a confrontation between the past and the present. And then there's a confrontation with animation, right? The body as animated. And what does grief look like when it is held in the body, right? Without those cues that we normally would think of that are supposed to register loss or grief. And he flips that around into, it's not my grief, it's you. You who's watching me, who might expect something of me. And there again, the sound of it, you're pushing me to actually write more about it, about, what does a sound do? I write about it in terms of, the transformation of sound into frequency, right? Something that goes from being really invasive to being ambient, even though it's at the same pitch and tone, it's the same throughout. But it's suddenly, you don't hear it when you're in the room after about 10 minutes. And that means something. That means your labor is going someplace other than to the oral. And it's not just about looking either. And so you're absolutely right. There is a kind of embodied presence that you are in contact with with the sounds of it. But yeah, these are all really provocative. You're going to send me back to this damn chapter again. Thank you.
Yeah, there was, but your question. Was it answered?
Your question. Your question.
About Black and Palestinian solidarity and not being transactional.
Right, yeah. So for me, adjacency is about, you may get nothing whatsoever out of this. So it is fun, you may get nothing out of this whatsoever that makes you feel better. Nothing. It is not transactional. It is frequently, completely imbalanced. And that's the work you have to do, is to be able to accept that too.
Thank you. The feat of endurance, am I remembering correctly? Just maybe at the cost of repeating myself, I was thinking through in my head for a long time attempting to do things like people's history, and particularly in places where it seemed like people had lived in conditions, post-colonial conditions of incredible violence and poverty. The search for people's movement or movements seemed to be the only way to reckon with or get at an understanding of what was happening, the ways in which people responded. So much of this thinking with waiting is a foray into thinking with, is trying to think with this absence of movement as generative, productive, and the feat of endurance it's when you say imperial conditions of coercive conditions of waiting, they are different in different places, but they're in some places viscerally highly militarized zones, yes, but in ordinary places you have also these structures of waiting, and to see them as a piece, and to think of the generative possibilities of including endurances.
Yes, thank you. I just want to thank you all for this mind-blowing day. This question is for Tina. I wonder if you'd be willing to dwell a little bit longer on the identity of the maker of the work, in thinking about, if we've all accepted the premise of wanting to move into this, having accepted the premise of this conference and moving into creating a new kind of community, the relationship between the identity of the maker and the making of work that does delve into the experience of another person and their history or whatever story is of the moment, and thinking a little bit more about Dana Schutz and how that plays into this, and the identity of the maker of this work, and had that been different, how might that have informed your thinking differently or not? And then the idea of the limits of allyship in this kind of making.
If his identity had been different, I probably wouldn't have written about his work. It's important to me. It's important to me. I mean, I don't feel the need to talk about, there's something quite extraordinary about his work, and there was something quite extraordinary about the protest of his work. And there's something, for me, that's important about thinking about the relationship of somebody who is mixed and of Pacific Islander heritage from a very different, legacy of colonization and dispossession, and allowing access to the different history of anti-Blackness, right? That is Britain, that is the United States, and not to claim ownership over it. And that's very important to me. And that's why his work is really important, because it forces us to think about the multiplicity of dispossessions. And I needed to make that point, because I needed to not think about anti-Blackness as the particular purview of a particular group. And that's different than necessarily allyship for me, because his ass was on the line. Like, he literally on the line. And he persisted. And that was important to me to be able to talk about, because it's not ancillary. Yeah.
I have a question. Hello. Thank you both for your work. My question is for Professor Campt. And so you mentioned Arthur Jafa, and your presentation brought to mind his work Apex, which I recently saw for the first time. Because I think that the presentation is somewhat similar. It's kind of very immersive and in a dark room. And I think there's a similar kind of destabilization of stillness and movement in that work. And I'm wondering whether you put these in conversation or if like his idea of like these kind of spooky entanglements between those hundreds of images in Apex might have anything to do with your ideas of adjacency.
Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes. No, the long answer is yes. I mean, there is a particular, a similar kind of vertigo that happens in Apex. But that one has to do with the exact opposite, has to do with velocity as opposed to stillness, right? But, you know, the stillness is the velocity of seeing 800 plus images, still images, in 8 minutes, right? So what does it mean to actually withstand that? What is the kind of affective labor that you have to do to sustain some kind of relationship to that? And those images range from glorious to graphic. And what does it mean to sustain a relationship to, you know, the history of anti-blackness in the United States and elsewhere, right? Everything from, you know, necklacing to lynching to like Lauryn Hill to Jesse Norman, right? Again, yes, they have everything to do with each other, and it's kind of part of a sustained line of thinking that is about, you know, sort of the intricacies of the Black gaze. I think we have to wrap up. I'm exhausted. Oh, but go ahead. Okay. Okay. Go ahead. I'm not exhausted at all.
I'll be very quick in that you just mentioned like the artist putting his ass on the line.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in how maybe risk becomes a component of adjacency that is not quite evident in or not quite there in allyship. And I wanted to ask about just risk in both of your presentations in terms of, I think adjacency maybe asks of various viewers to risk undoing themselves in spectatorship.
So put. That's so beautifully put. I mean, I was going to say, you know, it's about, you know, when we were talking about sort of it not being transactional, what goes hand in hand with that is that transaction is not equal, and at the same time, you leave yourself vulnerable through that inequity, right? That you are putting yourself in a place of vulnerability by virtue of the fact that you're not necessarily going to get anything back, right? But you are trying to understand this situation of disparity, right? Of dispossession as inequitable, right? So yes, there is a profound level of vulnerability going on, but you know, the undoing of self is a much better way of putting it, because what's happening is the terms of your comfort, the terms of your place in the world, have through this proximity, right, become unmoored, right? So you don't have the confidence of, okay, this is who I am, and it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with you, and in ways that make me no longer stable.
Thank you.
All right, we're over. Thanks so much for this really wonderful conversation.